Tonight, Labor politicians in Victoria claiming to be inclusive, boycott the traditional reading of the Lord's Prayer, and why King Charles's cancer diagnosis could be worse than you're being told. An amazing 40,000 Chinese illegal immigrants crossed the US-Mexican border in a year, plus complaints about a racist art exhibition that tells whites to leave the country. Where is this hatred taking us? And amazing footage too of the Queensland Premier that I'll show you, the footage that should shame him. But first, no surprise, the Liberals today gave in and said they'd back Labor's rejigged tax cuts, despite it being a broken promise. So some advice for Peter Dutton, the opposition leader. Now to move on to a different target, and I have one. It's a huge Labor weakness that's hurting poorer Australians and threatening the future of millions of young Australians. And I say I have advice when, look, I've got to admit that Peter Dutton's actually been doing pretty well so far. That's because, of course, the Liberals have, I hope, finally learned their lesson from Malcolm Turnbull. Their disastrous decision, insane really, to choose Malcolm Turnbull as their leader some years ago and as our Prime Minister. Choose a vain, treacherous main chancer, an ungrateful and vengeful man who could just as well have joined Labor if it would have made him Prime Minister instead. And it was so bad because not only is Turnbull a lousy, well, he was a lousy Prime Minister who lost 38 news polls in a row before his party finally dumped him. He's also a megalomaniac, now apparently out to smear and tear down just about every Liberal leader he reckons done him wrong, or will show him up. Tony Abbott, Scott Morrison and now Peter Dutton. Last night on the ABC, Turnbull was at it again, smirking and stabbing, this time trying to stab Peter Dutton.
If I said the name Peter Dutton, what one word springs into your mind?
Thug.
But Dutton today refused to bite, up to a point.
I think I've proven in the past that I'm able to deal with one liar at a time. And we're now dealing with the Prime Minister who has lied straight to the Australian public, and I don't think Australians will reward that. That's my sense.
Are you a thug?
Have you found me to be a thug? I think some of the narrative is sort of retrofitting a particular purpose.
In fact, Dutton has not been a thug or a bully as Liberal leader. He's led a party that after years of division, particularly under Turnbull, looks incredibly united, no real friction. And unlike Turnbull, with his global warming fixation, Peter Dutton has got the big calls right so far. Interestingly, he has actually fought the culture wars that Turnbull and Prime Minister Scott Morrison after him would not. He fought The Voice, for instance, Labor's plan to divide us by race, and defeated it. Now, yes, he is caving in and saying yes to Labor's new tax package, even though it is a broken promise that steals thousands of dollars from better-off taxpayers and gives $15 a week to the less well-off. But Dutton couldn't possibly stand in the way of more cuts for millions of Australians in battler suburbs.
There are very few Australians who could say today that they are better off under Anthony Albanese than they were under the coalition government. And if you speak to people, economists, business leaders, they are very concerned about the second half of this year as well. So the coalition is not going to stand in the way of providing support to Australians who are doing it tough.
Now, I've argued here for the Liberals actually keeping their word as well and demanding the Stage 3 tax cuts be kept, while also matching Labor's bigger tax cuts to lower income Australians. But Dutton said today he couldn't do both, or not yet.
If you implement Stage 3 now, in addition to what the Prime Minister's done, and we've looked at all of these options, you need to find about $9 billion a year, which is no easy task. You can't redesign a tax package within a fortnight from opposition. The PBO doesn't turn around costings that quickly.
And they're suggesting they'll do something about bracket creep later, but we'll see. Now, caving in may be politically wise, but it does put Dutton on the back foot now to some extent and leaves the Prime Minister today gloating. In fact, Albanese was demanding the Liberals stick to their word on the Stage 3 tax cuts when he didn't stick to his own.
If they are fair income, then their response must be to not only oppose what we are putting forward with our legislation we'll introduce today, but to promise to roll it back. Unless they do that, then it's all just wind.
Yes, but on this issue, we're now down to noise and finger pointing. One side says, you're a liar. The other side says, we looked after the poor. How much the debate will now help Australians doing it tough? About zero. So yes, this advice to the Liberals, point out that Albanese is a liar, fine. But the Liberals now need to shift the debate to something that could help workers and battlers. And here's a big one. Immigration. And especially the catastrophic effect it's having on people wanting to buy a house. Today, the Reserve Bank decided not to cut interest rates, in fact, suggesting it might hike them again this year. Now, that's already a problem for anyone trying to buy their first home. But worse is this. This is our net immigration intake over the past 120 years. As you can see, under Labor, it's gone absolutely insane. More than 500,000 people net into the country in a single year. That's nearly 6 times the average over the century. But meanwhile, compare that immigration intake, shown again here in red, to the blue line for houses actually built. We're taking in record amounts of immigrants at exactly the same time that we're building fewer houses for them. Now, building costs are soaring and big builders are going bust, another just this week. And the New South Wales Treasurer today admitted the obvious. We just aren't building the houses we need for the millions of people who now need them. Many of them immigrants. The big states are running way behind.
Last year we had about 48,000 completions. We look at Victoria that had about 58,000 completions. We know that we have a lot of work to do to catch up.
And it's not just buying a house that's a problem. This week, new data that there's a record low vacancy rate for flats and apartments in Sydney and near record lows in Melbourne and other cities. This is actually a social disaster. And it's again caused by these insanely big immigration rates. All those hundreds of thousands of new immigrants each year needing homes. And with stamp duty and red tape and green tape, making houses now impossible to buy for many young Australians.
If we do nothing, if we simply tolerate this status quo, then we run the risk of having a landed gentry where some people own homes and some people's ability to own homes depends on whether or not they're going to inherit wealth. And a lot of other people who work very hard won't have a realistic chance of home ownership. He's right.
And like I say, it's a social disaster made worse by decisions taken by the Albanese government. You see, having your own house, when I say social disaster, it's not just a nice thing, something that gives people security. It's also a civilising influence. Ask yourself, what do people look after more? A house they own or a house they rent? What binds them more to their community? A house they own or a house they rent? What makes a young bloke settle down faster? I'll tell you what, it's a mortgage. And I have a solution on that for the Liberals. Apart from slashing immigration, I mean really slashing, which would be good in so many other ways too. Stopping urban sprawl, stopping this terrible crowding of our cities, and also helping national cohesion. Well, the solution is to let people use some of their super to pay their mortgage. Let them transfer that super to a mortgage offset account, money that would go back into their super account if they sell the property. Labor would scream at this. Their union mates running the big super funds would hate it. This would be an attack on their crony capitalism and the way they use our super savings to push their woke agendas on everything from The Voice and global warming to affirmative action. But the former senior Treasury official who suggested this plan to me reckons a couple transferring a maximum of $50,000 each from their super to paying off their mortgage would save $6,500 in interest a year. And I reckon the Liberals should go for this. I mean, this kind of immigration is fracturing our country, lowering wages, crowding out cities, above all, keeping young couples out of their first house. So the Liberals need a new issue to put the heat on Labor. This could be it. And to a protest today at Parliament House against this green energy crusade that has already had so many Australians protesting this against this wrecking of our landscape. So much of our magnificent countryside is being turned into wind factories, industrial zones really. Even the views off the most beautiful parts of our coast, like near Wilson's Prom, can you believe it, to be ruined by planned wind factories out in the distance. Now, under Labor's plans, federal Labor, we're going to get 9 times more wind farms than we already have, and many more solar farms, and 10,000 kilometres of transmission wires to hook them all up, roaming like triffids over the countryside. Well, this morning, hundreds of protesters rallied in Canberra to say enough.
As a 6th-generation farmer, I don't care what they think of me in here. That's their business. I couldn't care less. I'm here today to fight for the next generation.
I was joined earlier by a farmer at that protest, Kevin Tung from Loomera in New South Wales. Kevin Tung, thank you so much for joining me. Why are you at this protest?
Andrew, we are very concerned about the rollout of these renewables to produce electricity for the eastern residents of New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, and it is all going on prime agricultural land. Prime agricultural land is there to produce food and fibre for our nation and for, exporting to overseas countries. So the more land we take out of primary production, the worse off we are going to be as a country.
This is actually quite personal for you though, isn't it? I mean, you've got a massive solar farm and big transmission wires to hook it up coming right near your doorstep.
It is. It is right next door to us. There is a solar factory being in production, in the near future of 900 hectares, which is 850,000 solar panels, which equates to about 20,000 SCGs. So it's an enormous piece of land out of our primary production categories that produce food and fibre. And on the other end of Loomera, we have got the transmission lines coming from the New England res, which is Armidale, Walker, Bendemeer, down to Liddell, running through 5 or 6 properties at the end of Loomera and through Dungowan and Dengelmar. So a real concern in all aspects as to the way we are going with this renewable energy construction.
I just want to remind people that for every wind and solar farm you're seeing now under Labor's plans, we're going to get 9 more. What's your issue with all this? I mean, for me, just driving through the landscape, it just really offends me to see these damn things that are very inefficient and expensive ways of making electricity, but they're eyesores. They're just, I don't want to see this in the countryside. What's your problem with them?
Exactly as you have said, they're an eyesore. As we were coming down here from Tamworth to Canberra, there was the big one at Wellington. You see nothing but black glass on good agricultural land. So, it is very concerning. And the cost of it, the cost of it to our grandchildren. Our grandchildren are going to pay for this for years to come. And that really concerns me, that I've got 11 grandkids. There's quite a few of them are interested in agriculture, coming back onto the farm, and we've got to look after them. But we will be paying for this for years to come. And the transmission lines, you cannot do a lot of farming underneath them. They're an eyesore. And the problem with aerial agriculture today is that our seeders, our crop dusters, our sprayers will not fly near transmission lines.
But, Kevin, we're told, of course, though, that green energy is good for the planet. Do you agree with that?
It is probably good for the planet. We're not totally against solar. I've got solar on the 3 houses that are on my property to try and reduce the use of, coal-fired generation. But look, it is not going to work. We cannot rely solely on wind and sun to power us With these huge battery storages, we have got to have some other form of generation to give us a base load, whether it be nuclear, whether it be another clean, green, coal-fired power station or something like that. We have got to have base load power for the use of a night time.
Now, there are, 2,000-3,000 people at this rally. What does the size of the crowd tell you?
The size of the crowd tells me there is a lot of concern about the way this Australian federal government is pushing the renewable infrastructure on agricultural land, also out in the ocean where they're wanting to put these wind turbines out in the sea off the New South Wales coast. So there are a lot of people concerned about it, from the fishing industry, from the tourism industry, and it is just a great concern all over for everyone involved in agriculture, whether it be farming, fishing, horticulture. They're all concerned about the impact that this is going to have on the viability of Australia.
Kevin Tunga, it's a different Australia than the one I grew up with, that wide brown land idea, land of sweeping ranges, every one of them now to be dotted with a damn wind turbine that you can see from miles and miles away. I mean, it's just really appalling what this is doing to the landscape. Save the planet, ruin the landscape. All the best to you and everyone there in your crusade against these things.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for taking me to give you an insight into what we feel in the northwest of New South Wales. And, it is really a blight on our country that Mr Albanese and Mr Bowen are not listening to the people.
Here is interesting, you might think unexpected support for that rally today is from Jeff Mosley. You might recall he used to be head of the Australian Conservation Foundation, was still respectable in our main green group. And he says, the rally has my full support. Backing renewables, regardless of their impacts, is a sign that with endless economic growth, all ecological boundaries are at risk. I might not agree with exactly how he phrased it, but still. Joining me every Tuesday is Nationals MP Matt Canavan, the former Resources Minister. Matt Canavan, it seems that older environmentalists, including, of course, former Greens leader Bob Brown, they're getting it about all these wind towers.
Yeah, look, and I find myself in the surprising situation where I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with these environmentalists, these people who I wouldn't see eye to eye on many other political issues, including Bob Brown. But none of us want to destroy our landscape. None of us want to see the wanton destruction of the Australian bush just so some foreign investors can make some money. Obviously, we come at the climate change issue from different approaches, but what's happening out there in the bush is an absolute atrocity right now. This is the biggest issue in the bush that's appeared and come to Canberra today. People are up in arms about their pristine landscapes being destroyed by massive industrial landscapes. To give people at home some kind of perception of what's going on, the flag at Parliament House here, just behind me on the screen, that flag is 100 metres tall. Some of the wind turbines going up near Rockhampton, where I live, 300 metres tall. So they're 3 times the size of that flagpole in Canberra. And I don't think the people of Canberra would even take one of those monstrosities on the tops of their mountains. We're getting 60 of those just in that project. So that's why you've had this reaction. I hope people across Australia wake up to this now and listen to their nation's farmers, listen to their custodians of our bush landscape, our heritage, and don't destroy that before it's too late.
Matt, I saw something that just really shocked me, to be honest. Yesterday, I covered the horrific stabbing death of Violene White in Ipswich. She was 70 years old, stabbed allegedly by youths in the shopping centre car park right in front of her 6-year-old granddaughter. Can you believe that? Well, there's only one way to react, I would have thought, to this. But today, Premier Stephen Miles gave a big speech, and was asked by Sky News Brisbane Bureau Chief Adam Waters why he hadn't mentioned youth crime in his checklist of things to do. And have a look at the Premier, amazingly, laughing it off.
The absence of any reference to youth crime in your speech to the Queensland Media Club would have been noted. by more than a few, including the people of those communities. Premier, I'm sure you can see the last 2 summers have been bookended by the murders of young mother Emma Lovell and just 3 days ago, grandmother Violene White, her daughter Denise.
Matt, he went on to say, oh, look, you're wrong, we've got more police on the beat. But that reaction there, that's just astonishing.
It's very, very weird, Andrew. Bizarre behaviour from the Premier. I think he needs to explain himself, particularly given that he's been part of a government that has weakened youth justice laws. His laws a few years ago in 2019 made it clear that judges had to only deny bail as a matter of, as their law says, a last resort. It's left Queensland with far too many violent criminals let out of situations where they just shouldn't be on our streets. And now I don't know the circumstances of this particular vile act in the recent days, but I just don't think the government seems to take the crime issue seriously in Queensland. They only do things, they only apply band-aids when there's a little bit of public outcry and controversy. And I bet you they do have some kind of response now because there'll be outrage over this, but they just don't take the issue seriously. It seems like it's a joke for them. And it's not good enough for the Queenslanders that are suffering under this crime epidemic that's occurring at the moment.
To me, it just looked like a political operative treating everything just as a political problem rather than, we're talking about people's lives here. Matt, one of the most shocking things the Liberals did in the past 10 years was to make Malcolm Turnbull their leader and our Prime Minister. I said on day one, I wrote a whole column about it, they'd regret this. He was not the man for the job, not the man for the Liberals. And now on the ABC's Nemesis documentary, part 2 was last night, he was making sure that the Liberals would regret it by abusing Peter Dutton as a thug, Scott Morrison as duplicitous, and Tony Abbott as unspeakable. A whole range of other Liberals, some in Parliament still, got him for a spray as well, and Nationals MPs. What is the lesson that should be learned from the disastrous reign of Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, we shouldn't do it again. Malcolm seems to be on a one-man mission to prove you right, Andrew, to show how wrong we were to select him. His conduct and behaviour since losing the leadership has only played into the hands of his critics and showing how right they were. And look, the lesson for us is not to behave like that. It was a terrible, it was really the original sin, I think, of the last coalition government to knock off Tony Abbott in that first term. He won the election, got us a huge majority. Yes, he was facing some heavy wins, but it could have worked out a lot differently if we'd persisted there and pushed through. Instead, we panicked, so the lesson is not to panic, to get together and push on with what you believe in. And unfortunately, we didn't do that, and the rest of the term was somewhat collared by that decision.
Yes, and I think for me the supreme lesson is pick someone who has the convictions of the party and sort of some sort of loyalty to the party. Don't think that someone who can turn it into something else is your saviour. Just quickly, the funniest thing I thought last night was to see Malcolm Turnbull still looking shocked and horrified that Liberal MPs have voted to replace him as leader, just like he had got them to do to Tony Abbott before him. Have a look at this hypocrite.
I looked around the room and I wondered whether all of the people there understood the enormity of what they were doing. The fact that they were treating the government of Australia as a plaything.
I think that total lack of self-awareness says it all, Matt. Says it all about this man.
That's the first time I saw it. I didn't watch it last night. That is quite funny. So thanks for giving us a laugh on the first day back at Parliament.
Good on you, Matt. Thank you very much, Matt Canavan, for your time. After the break, why the news of the King's cancer could be worse than we're told, and more trashing tradition by Labor MPs in Victoria, including a former film star, offended by the Lord's Prayer. But I also have to show you a truly amazing and disgusting video of a Greens MP. You won't believe the way she talks about Jews after this. Now, I suspect the news about King Charles is actually worse than he's letting on. He's announced he's got cancer, and in his statement said it was found when he was in hospital for a procedure for a benign prostate enlargement. It's a separate cancer, it's not prostate cancer, but he won't say what it is. Now, it did go on to say he has confidence in his treatment, but it is interesting that he rang both of his sons about this, and Prince Harry, the estranged almost Prince Harry, is, as we speak, flying over to see his father straight away. And while Charles, in the meantime, is not going to be doing public engagements while he's getting treated. Joining me is my Tuesday panel, Will Kingston, host of Australiana, a weekly podcast from The Spectator on politics and culture, and Danica Di Giorgio, Sky News presenter, and fresh from a triumph as host of a new chat show called The Jury on Sky News at Sundays at 8 p.m. Will Kingston, does it sound more serious to you as well?
We just don't know, Andrew. But therein lies the interesting element of this health crisis. I think what you'll see over the coming months is increasing pressure on the public to hear more about Charles's illness. You know, we live in a society today which demands transparency, which demands, touchy-feely sentimentality and the sharing of feelings. That's at odds with, say, the Queen's old stoicism. The way that the palace responds to this, and I suspect they will start to share more information on this story, the way they respond will tell you a lot about how they are thinking about evolving their attitudes on these sorts of issues in the wake of the Queen's long reign.
There is a family tradition, and not all of it good, of course. King Charles's grandfather, the public wasn't told that he had lung cancer. The public wasn't told that his mother had bone cancer. People suspected, but they weren't told. What do you make of all this, Danica?
Well, don't forget, the monarchy is notoriously private. As you mentioned, this is the way that they have always been. But I do think it is a concern that they have come out point blank and said that, in fact, it is cancer. One of the most telling signs, I believe, that this is more serious than they're letting on is the fact that Prince Harry has gotten on a plane very urgently and flown to the US, from the US to London. Harry has not had a face-to-face meeting with his father since the Queen died. He hasn't exactly jumped on a plane wanting to go and see them in recent years. So I think that that in itself is particularly telling, and we should also wait and see how long he stays there for. If he's only there for a few days, maybe we can breathe a sigh of relief. But you've got to feel for King Charles. He waited his entire life. He waited 70 years to be monarch, and this is a complete shock. But we also know, of course, Princess Kate has been in hospital, so it's been a real rough trot for the monarchy.
I'll jump in there, Andrew. I don't think we can read too much into Harry's play. We know that they are incredibly calculating about PR. He knows he'd be crucified, absolutely crucified, if he was, and seemed to be uncaring if he didn't do this. So I actually don't think that actually is insightful in and of itself. I think it could very well just be a calculating PR move.
We shall see. That's a good point too. But it does put the focus on Prince William as the next in line for the throne. So I should imagine, I think he's ready myself. I think he's just about as ready as anyone can be.
Yeah.
Danica, today in the Victorian Parliament, 6 Labor MPs boycotted the reading out of the Lord's Prayer. That's usually to start Parliament. They entered only after it had been read, and they included, of course, my own local MP, Paul Mercurio from Strictly Ballroom. Shame on you, Paul. The reading of the Lord's Prayer, though, Danica, they think bringing Christianity into this is divisive or whatever. Your response?
Well, now Christianity is apparently divisive. Andrew, everything is divisive in this generation. Everything offends people, everything upsets people. It's also worth pointing out that the MPs staged this stunt because of the comments that the Pope made calling to ban surrogacy. I mean, for goodness sake, you don't have to agree with what the Pope said. I don't agree with what the Pope said, but is it going to make me late for work? Is it going to make me not rock up and do my job properly? No, of course not. They are adults. They are elected members of Parliament. Go in and do your job. If this had happened, for example, in the Welcome to Country, which follows the Lord's Prayer in Parliament, can you imagine the backlash that we would hear. It would be all over the media. The media would be all over it. We haven't heard anything like that from... I barely saw any articles on this, to be honest, today. So people are barely even looking at it. But look, this is ridiculous. Leave Christianity out of it.
Plus, of course, Will, the Pope does not speak for Methodists and Anglicans and Presbyterians and go down the list. Baptists, go down the list. I mean, seriously, what is this stupid stunt?
We probably have different views on this, Andrew. I don't think that the prayer is appropriate in a secular Western democracy and Parliament. But because of that, I'm not going to run off this show in a huff and boycott it in this childish manner. These sorts of stunts are rubbish that the Greens introduced into our politics and Labor is now happily carrying on with. They're politicians. If they want to change something, they can. They can argue for it. They can persuade people. They can create policies, and then they can take those policies, say, to an election. I hate this nonsense where they feel they have to make these sort of stunts when they are in power and they have the mechanisms to change things if they want.
Well, it's interesting, you know, that Christianity is under threat, the reading of the Lord's Prayer, because the Labor Party has been talking about removing it completely. Well, whereas, you know, Christianity, most Aborigines are actually Christians. So how much the Welcome to Country represents them, I do not know. Christianity does. I'm just appalled by footage that I've seen from New South Wales Greens MP Jenny Leong. It's just come out. She's talking here about the tentacles of the Jews extending everywhere in this country. It's a meeting of the Palestine Justice Movement. I tell you what, this is something that sounds like, wow, if I'd heard this in Nazi Germany, I'd know I'd be making some conclusions. But to hear this sort of talk in Australia today from a Greens MP, have a listen.
The Jewish lobby and the Zionist lobby are infiltrating into every single aspect of what is ethnic community groups. They rock up and they're part of the campaign. They offer support for things like the campaign against the 18C racial vilification laws. They offer solidarity. They rock up to every community event and meeting to offer that connection because their tentacles reach in to the areas that try and influence power. And I think that we need to call that out and expose it.
Danica, those Jews, their tentacles are everywhere. They rock up everywhere in all sorts of issues. There's a Jew. I mean, what do you make of this?
Look, if you were a Jewish person in the community right now listening to that, you would be extremely offended. This is just another comment that's been made by this Greens MP. She has notoriously attended multiple pro-Palestinian rallies in New South Wales over recent months. She's also criticised what she calls, quotes, Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian land. Look, it is highly offensive, and it's also my understanding that the tentacles word or the name was actually used in a Nazi cartoon, you know, back in that day. So it is highly offensive, and we expect a lot more from elected members of Parliament. It is truly unacceptable.
I'm sure she didn't mean it in the Nazi sense of the word, but she should be far more conscious of the history of this, this word, and in fact the use of the octopus as a symbol of those Jews being everywhere. Honestly, Will, if someone went to talk to her about, oh, those Muslims, they're everywhere, their tentacles are everywhere, she'd be horrified. But apparently you can say that about the Jews and no alarm bells goes off in her little head.
Yep, appalling but not surprising, Andrew. Anti-Semitism runs like a toxic river through the Greens party. The interesting thing about that video for me is notice how she put the Jewish lobby and the Zionist lobby in the same breath. Anti-Semitism, or the line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in Australia, is now almost so blurred as to be indistinguishable.
Yep.
In fact, I would suggest that for many people, anti-Zionism is just a politically correct way of being anti-Semitic. I suspect that's the case for this MP, and unfortunately, I suspect it's the case for many other people in society.
Well, I'm hoping that Jenny Leong doesn't mean that at all, that she, like I say, she's just purely ignorant, willfully, stupidly ignorant. and will apologise. I think an apology would actually set a lot of minds more at rest, that she could use that kind of charged language. And I expect she will hear from them. In fact, she can come on the show tomorrow and say how sorry she really is that she didn't mean it. That would be very good. Will Kingston, Danica DiGiorgio, thank you both so much for your time. After the break, nearly 40,000 Chinese have illegally crossed the border into the United States in 1 year, and President Biden does nothing. And where is Donald Trump's wife? Is she boycotting his campaign? I'll talk to someone who knows her. He'll tell. Here's an interesting survey. 17,000 people from 36 countries all around the world were asked, where would you most like to live? And the answer is this: the top 20 countries, Australia ranks third, but check what every one of these most desirable countries has in common. They're all Western, they all have a strong Christian heritage, they're all democracies, and all, dare I say it, have strong ethnic European or white demographics. Plus, of course, they're rich, which is a consequence of Western culture. And you contrast that with the stories you're told of how whites are racist and Western culture is racist and Western nations are oppressors and, oh, capitalism. The fact is that Western culture has created civilizations that people around the world would love to join. And that is why those same Western countries now face mass illegal immigration from the rest of the world. Immigration at such levels that it's changing the character of some of these Western countries. France, for instance, now 10% Muslim, mainly North African. The West is attracting so many people who actually change it from what it was that attracted the people in the first place. And what then are the people who always lived in these countries? What about their homeland over in Europe? Or, well, look even at the United States. Under President Joe Biden, there are now about 20 million illegal immigrants. More than 2.5 million illegal immigrants crossed the Mexican border last financial year. And not just from Latin America, but from Africa, and now even from China. Nearly 40,000 in the past year, as America's 60 Minutes has just reported.
Just after sunrise, we saw the first group of migrants make their way from Mexico through a gap between the 30-foot steel border fence and rocks, ducking under a bit of razor wire and into the United States. We were surprised to see the number of people coming through from China, nearly 7,000 miles away. Careful, watch.
Joining me is Sean Spicer, the former White House press secretary for President Donald Trump. Sean Spicer, thank you so much for joining us. So many Chinese illegal immigrants now joining this flood of people crossing your border with Mexico. What is going on there?
Well, my guess is that they, like so many others, recognize that there's an open and porous border, with Mexico that we share. And that's the concerning part, Andrew, is that you have to wonder why. These aren't Southern migrants moving their way up. We've got them from India, from Russia, obviously male Chinese military-aged men trying to come in. I guess it makes sense if your goal is to infiltrate the United States and you know that the door is open, so to speak. But it's concerning to me that that shouldn't be the priority of both parties, right? The Democrats here in the United States are looking to negotiate on that. National security shouldn't be something that we have to negotiate over, whether or not we're letting in Chinese, military men from China, whether we're letting fentanyl or other suspected terrorists, shouldn't be a partisan issue. And it's sad and pathetic that we have to trade to get national security issues like that addressed.
What is it that's so hard about closing a border? It seems to me quite extraordinary that it's so porous that you get 2.5 million people crossing this border with Mexico in a single year. I know it's long, and I know you'd have to deploy a lot of people and build more fences, but seriously, how can it be that porous?
Because we have strained resources. We let people know that if they get in, that they can stay. The thing that I find fascinating about this is that we have ports of entry, right? Border crossings that are staffed and manned by U.S. personnel. And yet we see these people who are claiming asylum not go through those ports of entry. They're climbing over fences, they're going through rivers and such. And my point is that they were really trying to follow the process. We have a process and ports of entry that you go through. They're clearly not doing this for a reason, because they know that this administration will let them stay. We're having stories of people staying in hotels in New York, to the tune of really nice hotels. We're talking about handing out gift cards to them and phones. And I mean, we might as well have a big blinking sign that says, come on in, here's what you get for arriving. At the same time, we're not treating our own citizens, our veterans, in a way that's acceptable. But I mean, the answer is, I think when the word gets out that you're welcome to come in and that it'll take you potentially up to 9-10 years before your case ever gets heard, if you choose to show up, why would you go through any other means to do this? But like I said, the fentanyl crisis alone should be one thing. The number of people who are entering who've been on our terrorist watch list should be another. These reports of Chinese men of military age should be another thing. But yet that doesn't seem to concern the folks on the left who believe that this is something that we have to trade for or negotiate over. And that to me is something that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime.
I guess it coincides with this idea that to be nationalistic is racist and Trumpian and all that kind of stuff.
But Andrew, that's
the left seems to put
there's folks on the left that believe that. But I am come to believe that this administration recognizes that it's more than a philosophical thing. They truly do look at this as potential future voters. And there's when you walk through the process, they want them to come in. They will give them legal status. They give them temporary work right away ability. And yes, then they start talking about a path to citizenship. It is laughable to think that that's not the plan. And I find it, for those folks in America who don't see what's going on, I feel like I don't know what else you could do to show them it, because it's not philosophical about, there is a subset of folks that believe that. But the vast majority of these folks do it for purely political reasons.
Well, millions of votes are quite handy if the Democrats can count on them, so maybe you're correct. But Sean Spicer, speaking of Trump, there are now sniping articles asking where his wife is, Melania. Why isn't she by his side campaigning, family rift, all that kind of stuff? There's a daughter, Ivanka, too. What can you tell us about all this?
Well, look, I think if you go back to 16 and 20, she picks her moments. She goes out there. She's obviously very supportive of him, number one. Number two, she has a son that's still in school, Barron, and I think she has always prioritized being a mother to him. If you're going to have a dad that's out on the campaign trail, it's nice to have another parent that's there, and that's the role that she's always cherished and made it very clear that that's her first priority. So I think we will see more of her. Like she did, she picks her moments. She'll come out on the trail. The president addressed this a little while ago, saying that, after a lot of the abuse that his kids had to take, that he wanted them to maybe dial it back a little and pick their moments. But you see Don Jr. out there very forcefully on a regular basis. Eric Trump has been out there as well. So it's, I think that the media is always looking to find something.
Yeah, I guess so. And some of the abuse of Barron, his youngest son, I thought was just absolutely outrageous, including from a couple of Democrat politicians, I think, who had to apologise for it. But it's so brutal. I don't think a lot of people realise how brutal it can be, and that there are humans at the end of it. Sean Spicer, always great to talk to you. Look forward to catching up with you next week. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
Well, that didn't take long. Jenny Leong, the Greens MP, who said the Jews are everywhere, they're tentacles. When they rock up to meetings, has now apologised. She didn't know octopus was an anti-Semitic trope, and she didn't quite, well, I don't know. Maybe she didn't know that, but I tell you what, the Jews are everywhere is poison enough. After the break, the shocking decision by a premier to shut down an inquiry into how children are being allowed, or even encouraged, really, to change their gender. Is this a cover-up? And complaints about a government-funded art gallery promoting racial division. There have been growing worries, we've covered some of them here, about the transgender movement. It's almost a fashion, really, that's pushing even children who say they're confused about their gender identity into taking hormones to suppress their puberty and then later surgery to supposedly change their gender. In South Australia, one independent member of its upper house wanted a parliamentary inquiry into this, and some Labor MPs and Liberals were thinking of backing it. But today, Premier Peter Malinauskas said no, killed off the inquiry by ordering Labor MPs not to vote for it. He said he didn't want to give them a conscience vote because the inquiry would be used in the culture wars. Well, joining me on Culture Wars is Rowan Dean, editor of The Spectator Australia and host of Outsiders on Sky News every Sunday at 9 a.m. Rowan, what an extraordinary decision.
Yeah, Andrew. Well, I'm glad Peter Malinauskas has given our little segment Culture Wars a plug. That's very generous of him. But, Andrew, there is nothing more awful than watching political cowardice in action. Cowardice of the worst kind. Cowardice that potentially affects the health, well-being and even lives of young children. And for a Premier who's in charge of the education system and the health system in a state, to avoid a perfectly legitimate inquiry into the potential abuses both in the education system and the health system of young children is an absolute disgrace. Now, let's be really clear here. There are, of course, genuine gender dysphoria issues that psychiatrists and psychologists and medical professionals have to deal with and always have dealt with in the past. What we're talking about with the transgender issue is an explosion, a literal explosion in the last few years of young boys and young girls basically desperate to change their gender, their sex, and go through the most horrific and painful and potentially extremely dangerous in the long run health procedures to do so, and often encouraged by certain health professionals or educators. So the Premier has a real responsibility here, and to avoid that responsibility shames him and shames everything he stands for. There are parents out there now whose children in South Australia will in future years, and this is simply based on what is happening around the world, where the number of children or adults who were transitioned as children are now regretting it and now detransitioning with the most horrific stories of they themselves claim to have been mutilated, they themselves claim to have been pressured into going through this sort of surgery or chemical castration. They themselves deeply, deeply regret that no one stood up and said, are you sure you really want to do this? Particularly girls who will never be able to have babies and obviously boys who now regret that they have gone through whatever measures. So Peter Malinauskas stands utterly condemned for cowardice, for refusing to accept that this issue is around the world, one that has been confronted. It is not a question of just bowing to the science, as he says. We've already seen in COVID how that can go awry. It is a question of the health and well-being of young South Australian children, boys and girls, who will be, to put it bluntly, mutilated and will later regret it and will be looking who to blame and will be able to look back at Peter Malinauskas and say, this man was too scared, too cowardly to stand up and protect our interests. He stands utterly condemned.
Well, I've got a lot of time for Peter Malinauskas, but this has to be the worst decision I've heard him make. We've actually had, in Britain, its leading gender reassignment clinic closed because of controversy about what it was actually doing. Now, for him to actually close it for, oh, look, there might be a debate, it might be politicised. In fact, the whole argument is that people pushing it have politicised gender reassignment. They're the ones doing it. And if you're afraid of it, where a debate might take you, you shouldn't be in the business.
And not only politicises it, Andrew, as we saw in the United States, there are examples of people making a lot of money out of this, which is even more disgraceful. And that is why around the world, politicians are looking at this issue and saying it is our responsibility to look into this and see whether it is being abused, which it clearly, arguably is.
It clearly, arguably is. I find this just astonishing. If you cannot have a debate, I mean, cancel culture right in the top of the South Australian political system. Rowan Dean, thank you so much for your time. I'm as flabbergasted as you are. Well put. I don't have time to get into that government-funded museum preaching racial division. I'll do that tomorrow. It's just too much. Enough, I'd say, enough. But that's it from me. Coming up next, Sharry Markson. From me, though, good night.